Hello, my name is William Lara, and I'm here to discuss the findings of my systematic literature review on the research topic, the effects of blood flow restriction training on the sprint performance of competitive swimmers. So for a brief background on blood flow restriction training, it was first developed by Dr. Yoshiaki Sato. During a festival, he was kneeling and he experienced pain caused by blood flow restriction. And he likened this pain to the pump which we experience during workout. And he spent the next 40 years developing and researching blood flow restriction and its applications to sports performance and training. So next is the statement of the problem. So the goal of every country's sports program is to produce quality athletes who are competitive on the international field. Obviously, these athletes are where they are due to the presence of world-class facilities, equipment, and training which are supplied by their government. Unfortunately, the opposite has been experienced by the Philippines, at least with regards to its swimming program, in which we've seen mediocre performances for the past few years. This can be attributed to the country's lack of world-class facilities, equipment, and advancements in training methods. While the setup and acquisition of facilities and equipment are difficult due to the political implications, due to the fact that these require a large budget, there are indeed cheap and feasible alternative training methods which are used by leading nations, which we can employ to our own swimming programs across the country. And BFR aims to improve the country's swimming program by adopting an alternative training method which is backed by research and science. And lastly, we have the objectives of the systematic literature review. So first, we want to summarize the available literature on the effects of blood flow restriction training on the sprint performance of competitive swimmers. Second, we want to describe the mechanism of action through the physiological effects BFR has on the body. And lastly, we want to determine the components of sprinting in which BFR directly improves or has direct applications to. So for the review of related literature, I focus on two main aspects, which are related to my second and third objectives. So first, I focus on the mechanism of action of BFR. We're asking, what are the physiological effects that BFR has on the body, and how does this apply or help sprinting specifically? So first, we have the increased recruitment of type 2 muscle fibers. So our body, our muscles, have two main umbrella fibers, our type 1 or slow twitch muscle fibers, and our type 2 or fast twitch. Our type 2 muscle fibers are dominant during fast, high-intensity activities such as sprinting. And when BFR is applied, the muscle oxygen concentration is decreased at a faster rate and induces a hypoxic or low oxygen state at an earlier rate. So during this hypoxic state, our slow twitch muscle fibers fatigue faster, and thus our fast twitch muscle fibers must be recruited earlier and to a greater extent. Next is the adaptation to metabolite accumulation and the subsequent protein synthesis. So during the hypoxic state, pyruvate is converted to lactic acid, and the accumulation of this metabolic byproduct seems to be the primary mechanism behind the benefits of BFR training. So studies show an improved buffer system as an adaptation to the accumulation of lactic acid. And studies also show that there is a subsequent acute increase in protein synthesis, which leads to an increase in muscle hypertrophy, which in turn leads to an increase in force production, which is beneficial for sprinting. Now lastly, there is an increase in muscle hypertrophy. As I said, an increase in muscle hypertrophy leads to an increase in force production, which is beneficial for sprinting. Now this happens because when blood flow restriction is applied, the muscle starts to swell with an acute increase in muscle strength due to the increased volume of each muscle fiber. Now this swelling will continue unless the venous block is removed, thus forcing the muscle fibers to adapt and grow in size, or else they'll burst. Now, the research strategy I used was a bottom-up approach. Bottom-up meaning I started from specific articles which directly relate to my research topic, then I moved up to more general articles which merely supplement the idea of my topic. So having said that, I segmented my research into 3 segments or themes. The first segment was about articles which directly link or are directly linked to my research topic. These articles are similar, if not exactly like my research topic, and directly answer the questions my research topic proposes. The second segment is composed of articles which supplement the general idea of the topic. These articles pertain to the components of sprinting in which BFR improves, and these are not necessarily confined to swimming only. And lastly, my third segment is about or contains articles which supplement the specific idea of my research, that being the mechanism of action. So these articles contain information about the physiological effects that BFR has on the body. In addition, I use the Sports Discuss EBSCO database as well as along with the ResearchGate and National Center for Biotechnology Information or NCBI database to find the articles needed for my research. Now, for relevancy's sake, an inclusion criteria was established for all 3 segments in order to screen the articles in which I would find. So for the first segment, only experimental studies which had competitive swimmers as its participants were chosen because this is directly related to the research topic. With regard to the age of the articles, they are relatively new, meaning 5 to 10 years old. For the second segment, 3 specific components of sprinting were chosen, namely the muscular size, muscular strength, and speed, and the effects BFR has on these 3 components. Now, for this segment, since the concept of sprinting isn't specific to swimming only, articles about the effects of BFR on other sports, such as running, were taken into account and used as supplementary material. And again, only experimental studies were chosen. Now, for the last segment, 3 specific physiological effects that BFR has on the body were taken into account. So first is the increased type 2 muscle fiber recruitment, the adaptation to metabolite accumulation and protein synthesis, and lastly, the increase in muscle hypertrophy. Now again, the articles about the effects of BFR on other sports, like running, were used as supplementary material. In addition, excerpts from exercise physiology books and articles were used for definitions and stuff like that. And again, only experimental studies were chosen. Now for the scope and the limitations of this research, this literature review only included journal articles which featured competitive athletes as its participants and did not include populations such as children, the sedentary, and the elderly. In addition, the rehabilitative effects of blood flow restriction as well as the effects of blood flow restriction on endurance training were also not taken into account. So for Chapter 4, I'm going to discuss the results of the research articles segment by segment. So for the first segment, only a handful of research articles were found that were directly related to the research topic. Fortunately, all of these were experimental in nature and compared the results of an intervention period between an experimental group and a control group. So in one study, it showed that a 3-week intervention period was sufficient to elicit significant improvements of the pre-test and post-test. So the results show that there was significant improvement between the pre-test and post-test times of the experimental group, and also there was significant difference between the results of the control group, the pre-test, post-test results of the control group and the experimental group. Another study showed that there were no significant improvements. However, this may be inconclusive because of the fact that in this study, only 6 out of the 14 participants completed the full 3-week training intervention program. And lastly, there was another study which showed that there were improvements between the pre-test and post-test of the experimental group. However, these were deemed insignificant. And All of these papers also had physiological improvements, such as improvements in upper body strength, anaerobic adaptation, and lactate adaptation, which I'll discuss in the next segments. Now, the second segment focused on the components of sprinting in which BFR directly improves, that being the effects of BFR on muscle strength, muscle size, and speed. Now, for muscle strength, research shows that there is indeed improvements in muscle strength as a result from training with blood flow restriction. One study, which compared the results of an experimental group and a control group, showed that the experimental group showed significant improvements in muscle strength as compared to the control group without BFR. And another study showed that there are similar strength gains between a group which underwent training with BFR and with low relative load, and another group which underwent training without BFR and this time with high relative resistance. Now, what we can get from this is that BFR makes training more efficient because less load is required to exhibit the same strength gains as conventional resistance training. However, it also should be noted that another study counters this point, so further research must be done. Another point of conflict is the effects that BFR has on muscle strength when non-resistance training is done. So one study showed that there were marginal strength gains as a result of applying BFR to walking. However, another study showed that there were no significant leg strength gains between an experimental group with BFR training and a control group without BFR training. So again, further research must be done. Now, BFR also had effects on increases in muscle size. Actually, currently BFR is mostly used for this purpose. Now, it is recommended that to induce muscle hypertrophy, one must lift at least 65% of his 1 repetition maximum or 1 RM, and studies found that when BFR is applied, only 20% of one's 1 RM is needed to induce muscle hypertrophy. Now, similar to the effects of BFR on muscle strength gains, there were similar findings or similar gains in muscle size of a group which underwent BFR with low relative resistance and a group which did not undergo BFR, which had high relative resistance. So again, this shows that BFR makes training efficient because less loads are required to exhibit the same muscle size gains as compared to conventional resistance training. Now, other studies showed that BFR training elicited significantly greater improvements in muscle size gains as compared to conventional resistance training when the loads were similar. And lastly, there were improvements in muscle size when BFR was applied to non-resistance exercises. Now, for most, if not all of these studies, the muscle size was tested through a magnetic resonance imagery or MRI, and the cross-section of the muscle was used to compare. BFR also has an effect on speed, which is a component of sprinting in which one must excel in order to perform well. Now, studies which tested the maximum sprinting time of both runners and swimmers showed significant improvements between the pre-test times and the post-test times of the experimental group which underwent an intervention period with BFR. Now, this means that their times were lowered or they were faster during the post-test, and this difference was seen as significant. Now, the last segment focuses on the mechanism of action of blood flow resistance training and what the studies say about the physiological effects that BFR has on the body. So first, as stated earlier, it is the increased recruitment of type 2 fast-twitch muscle fibers. Now, research shows that an important adaptation of BFR training is the early activation of our fast-twitch muscle fibers. So studies used an electromyography or EMG to see that there is indeed an increase in motor unit recruitment and motor neuron firing upon the restriction of blood flow. And since BFR induces a hypoxic state earlier, studies show that our fast-twitch muscle fibers are recruited earlier and to a greater extent. Next is the adaptation to metabolite accumulation and the subsequent protein synthesis. Now, first and foremost, during hypoxic BFR training, there's indeed an increase in metabolite accumulation more than normal, research shows. Now, one study shows that the lactate levels of the post-test of the experimental group of that study, meaning the group that underwent BFR training, was significantly lower than the lactate levels during the pre-test. Now, this is indicative of an improved sodium bicarbonate buffer system. Now, research also shows that the muscle protein synthesis increased during BFR training because, as mentioned, a buildup in lactic acid is linked to muscle protein synthesis. Now, this increase in muscle protein synthesis was not evident in training without BFR under the same resistance conditions. And lastly, a study showed that there was a 42% increase in muscle protein synthesis 3 hours post BFR training and a 69% increase 24 hours post BFR training. Now, to summarize this all, first, the research question arose as to whether or not blood flow restriction training could be used as a viable training method in improving the sprint performance of competitive swimmers. And to answer this question, the literature about the topic needed to be reviewed. The research strategy used to review the literature was to segment the main topic into 3 different themes or segments and use these respective themes as a basis for research. Now, the 3 themes were the mechanism of action of BFR, the components of sprinting in which BFR directly improves, and articles directly related to improving the sprint performance of competitive swimmers. Then a matrix was created in order to summarize the findings and also the methodologies of the respective studies. And lastly, the results of the research were discussed more thoroughly in the succeeding section. Based on the findings of the research, along with the analysis that followed, the following conclusions can be made. First, BFR training indeed has improvements in the components of sprinting through its mechanism of action. So, for example, there is an increase in muscle strength after BFR training, and this can be attributed to the fact that through BFR training, there's an increase in type 2 muscle fiber recruitment. However, in relation to the actual research topic at hand, there is no overwhelming evidence that BFR training improves the sprint swimming performance of competitive swimmers. Yes, when the skill of sprinting is broken down into its components and its physiological aspects, BFR greatly improves these factors. However, when the skill of sprinting is taken as a whole, and as a whole is applied to the race format, then there is no overwhelming evidence that BFR training improves performance in this context. And this is important because in sports such as swimming, the only definitive gauge of improvement is improved times, meaning you're getting faster times. Now, there are simply too few studies that have tackled this topic, and with the studies that have tackled this topic, the results vary. So further research must be done in order to answer the question as to whether or not BFR can improve the sprint swimming performance of competitive swimmers. The major limitation faced was simply the lack of literature which directly answered the research question at hand. This is why the research was expanded to see the effects of BFR on sprinting and other sports, because the concept and components of sprinting remain the same. While there was an abundance of articles about the supplementary themes, such as the mechanism of action and the applications of BFR, the fact remains that the best information for a literature review would come from articles which are directly linked or are directly related to the actual research topic. Recommendations include actively seeking out the authors of the studies since these studies are relatively new, and also simply waiting for more research to be done. Future researchers can also try to conduct the experiment themselves using the methodology of the authors or using the research proposal which is included in this literature review. Thank you for listening, and big shout out, big thank you to my panel, Ma'am Molly, Sir Rev, and especially to my advisor, the best advisor ever, Sir Wisdom, for guiding me even though I wasn't able to finish my actual thesis and complete this literature review. So thank you very much.